Hello and Shubha Vijaya to everyone. Thank you for joining us today in the 29th lecture of the Ant Biology webinar series. I'm Shinjini and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that you can post your questions in the YouTube chat box. We shall moderate them at the end of the session. And as always, a feedback link will be provided in the chat box at the end and it will not be sent by email. So, without further delay, I would like to request our mentor and convener of the series, Professor Renare Banerjee of the Department of Zoology, University of Calcutta, to welcome and introduce our speaker, Professor Kakali Bhattacharya.
Thank you, Shinjini. Maybe we could have Professor Kakali Bhattacharya also on the screen. Yes, that's better. A very, very warm welcome, Kakali. I wish I could see you in person and then we could do the Vijaya Kolakuli, which is now is the perfect moment to do that. A warm welcome to all our viewers tonight. And it is morning where our speaker will be speaking from tonight. And to all our viewers who will be logging in now or later, Ant Biology is a platform that was conceived specifically for the pandemic when we are all stuck at home, but it has turned out to be such a wonderful opportunity that we are able to do things which we probably normally wouldn't do. And what better way than to introduce you to the wonderful world of qualitative research that Professor Bhattacharya will be speaking about tonight. And I have known Professor Bhattacharya since when she was a little girl, and I was a slightly older girl, and it's been a long journey. And today, in fact, for the first time, I was reading your CV, Kakuli. I have been following your excellent academic career. But today, when I was reading your CV, I was, I do not know what would be the appropriate word, but you are the master of words, so maybe you can provide me with one. But I see that you have studied psychology and then mathematics and biochemistry. And for our students, I think that would be I do not know, a unique opportunity to understand what all one can do with academic education and higher education, because right now, not only because of the pandemic, but because of all situations combined and a large number of people going into higher studies, we are sort of at the crossroads, and probably we need to take some major decisions to change the course of how subjects are taught. So it is my absolute privilege to introduce you to our speaker tonight, and I will be reading from her wonderful CV, and this itself can be a sort of a subject for study for all of us. So here goes. Professor Kakali Bhattacharya is a professor of the Qualitative Research Program, Research, Evaluation, Measurement at the College of Education, University of Florida, USA. She did her Bachelor of Science from the McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada in 1995, majoring in psychology and minoring in biochemistry and mathematics. And at the end, we will have a question and answer session when I'm sure we will be having a lot of questions. The students will be having a lot of questions for our speaker. So this is how it started. And then she did her master's in instructional development from the South Illinois University of Carbondale, Illinois in 2000. She received her graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Georgia in 2002, and her graduate certificate in qualitative inquiry also from the University of Georgia in 2005. She did her PhD in educational psychology from the University of Georgia in 2005. Since then, she has held positions in several universities across USA, including the University of Memphis, Texas A&M University, Kansas State University, and University of Florida. And here comes the most interesting part, some of which we hope Professor Bhattacharya will elucidate further for us. Her research interest lies in decolonizing onto epistemologies, critical and decolonial educational anthropology, social foundation and cultural context of higher education, transnational, transnational education, critical and arts-based approaches to qualitative inquiry, creativity in educational research, contemplative pedagogies and epistemologies, gender, race, and ethnic studies in education, technology integrated learning, and social environments. Professor Bhattacharya has over 50 publications in refereed journals as editors, as well as books and book chapters. And she's also involved in a lot of other activities, which I hope that she will explain for us, because I know she wears so many hats that when I begin to introduce her, Banglaয় যাকে বলে খেই হারিয়ে যায়. I do not know where to begin and where to end. So with great pride in my heart, I invite Professor Bhattacharya to please deliver her lecture for us.
Thank you, Dr. Ray Banerjee. I'm so honored to do this. And I wish I was doing this in person so I could see the people and be in. I hope someday.
That will happen. Yes.
Someday I'll when it's safe to do so, I will look for a Fulbright and come and play more with you. But yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. And yes, we have known each other for a really long time. Professor Ray Banerjee is somebody that is very dear to me, and I hold her in the highest respect. And I actually am flabbergasted by the introduction, because I didn't know there was a Vita of me floating around on the web, but I guess there is. Just to update you from that Vita, at this point, I think my pub count is kind of around 90 or so. So I've been writing. I write a lot, and I have sort of, because I started in the sciences, as that was generally expected, a lot of us from our culture and community, that I wandered off to the sciences and found myself more drawn to psychology as I started taking some classes, and I moved over to that. So my understanding of science is very distant from where mostly the listeners and you are at the moment. So today I want to talk from the perspective of philosophy of inquiry more than science, but I will touch on some topics around education and science, and how might we want to reimagine science from a decolonizing lens. So thank you for that lovely introduction. I want to start with a very provocative quote that a Maori indigenous scholar from New Zealand said, and her name is Linda Tuhiai Smith, and she said, "Research is a dirty word." And the reason she said that was because the colonizers, when they colonized New Zealand, they would scalp indigenous skulls and put millet seeds in it. And then they would look for like how much millet seeds can an indigenous skull hold, and how much can other people's skulls hold. And using that, they tried to classify indigenous people as less than human and subhuman, and therefore deserving of dehumanizing treatment. So I start with that because I want to inspire us to think about things not in their innocence. I want to inspire us to think about things having value, having history, having context. So with that, I invite you all to join me anywhere you like. I am in multiple social media spaces. So if you are in these spaces, please come find me online, and we can have conversations online as well. So I want to start with what I said, philosophy of Inquiry. Dr. Ray Banerjee introduced some words that sounded very complicated and long words. And so I want to break down a little bit of the words. So there are many different philosophies of inquiry, and sometimes we're not introduced to all of them, and sometimes we're introduced to research via only one. And if we're introduced to research via only one philosophy of inquiry, what ends up happening is that we accept that because it came down from people that taught us and people that taught our teachers and people that taught our teachers' teachers. And so then we think research from that one perspective, and that creates a scarcity in the various different ways inquiry can be approached. So epistemology is known to be the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know is epistemology. And then ontology is the study of reality and being. And teleology is the study of purpose. And axiology is ethical orientation. So all four of these constructs inform the philosophy of inquiry. And sometimes we go straight to the executing steps, that we have to collect data this way, analyze data this way, and then depending on what we see in data, we can only claim this or that, and we have to remain in certain margins. And if we zoom out a little bit, then we can integrate some of these ideas that are philosophy of inquiry that will then inform how we move and do the actions that we engage in when we do research. So I want to unpack some of the slides that I have with some terms, and I have been writing decolonizing with a slash, so I'm going to explain why in a minute, but I want to just unpack these two terms that come up when we talk about decolonizing research or decolonizing generally or decolonizing education. So the world is generally divided with countries that have been once colonized. So that would be a country like ours in India. We had many colonizers in India. So and they have now left. So we are once colonized. However, we are not free from colonizing influences, because I'm delivering this lecture in English, and if you asked me to deliver it in Bengali, I would not be able to do it, because I have not been educated in these ideas in any other language other than English. And so when a language is lost, and we use the language of our colonizers, then you have to ask the question, what is lost in that? What can we not access anymore through that? Settler colonized is when the colonizers have settled in the land that they have colonized. So when the colonizers settle in the land they have colonized, that becomes a settler colonial country. So United States is a settler colonial country, Canada is a settler colonial country, Australia is a settler colonial country, New Zealand is a settler colonial country. So they have come to these lands and they have colonized the lands, and they have taken over a lot of lands that belong to the indigenous people of those lands. And then once colonizers settle into the land, they change everything. They change the infrastructure of the country, of the people, in terms of law, education, allocation of resources, all of those things. So decolonizing becomes resistance to the colonizers' ways of being, knowing, doing, all of it that comes into our everyday life. So that is decolonizing. And in a few minutes, I'll explain why I have been slashing the word decolonizing. So I want to introduce a scholar called Ndlovu Gatsheni, and he posits that through their territorialization in India, East Africa, and Southern Africa, colonial ideologies were formed to control and enslave the natives. And this should be a familiar idea to us, because we know that from our own history that this had happened. And then Mahmoud Mamdani, he explains that the native is not to be understood as original or authentic, but as a byproduct of the colonial state, and thereby synonymous with being colonized. Because there was no native before the colonizers arrived. So we were just people living on our lands. And then the colonizers arrive, and then this category starts coming up because it needs to be in relationship to the colonizers who are taking over land, infrastructure, resources, goods, money, all the things that are present in the land that they have invaded. So colonized native then marks a reductive state of being, identifying people who are cast out as uncivilized with their ritualized customs. These customs are simultaneously castigated and co-opted, repackaged, and commodified with limited access for the native colonized to their own customs. So a binary relationship then gets formed where you have the civilized colonizers and the uncivilized native. And then as a result of that, the natives' customs are seen as uncivilized, but then eventually the colonizers steal that too and co-opt it and then limit the natives' access to the co-opted, repackaged, modified theft of whatever it is that they have stolen. So I will give you an example. For example, like if you are in the part of the world that I'm in, yoga is done in ways that I don't recognize how I understood yoga. And then you Google yoga and you'll see a lot of white people's pictures in like beautiful picturesque space. And I honestly don't understand what that is about. It's so distorted and super expensive. And you can't teach yoga unless you go through some of these very white oriented schools to get certified in yoga. And because it takes place in certain zip codes where people can afford yoga, it's usually not in places where people of color can access that. And sometimes when I accessed it and I went to it, I couldn't even get to it. Some of them were having music that I thought was distorted with what yoga is. Sometimes we were in a gym room, very sweaty room, and it was 7:30 p.m. and we're doing sun salutation at 7:30 p.m. And I had a lot of dissonance with that. I didn't understand what was happening. So this is a small example, but this cuts across everything, cuts across education, cuts across legal policies, cuts across everything where access is limited from those from whom there has been theft committed. So Mamdani explains that a census was taken by the British colonizers to label those who migrated to African colonies as a race and those whom the colonizers deemed indigenous to the land as a tribe, often set up in competing relationships for resources and for legal, educational, and social rights. This separation centered geography and erased the history of migration, thereby erasing cultural histories and built-in reciprocities between people. Such separation pinned groups of people fighting against each other instead of resisting the colonizers. Or more aptly, this move positioned geography in opposition to history of the land so that the division between racial and tribal people and its associate privileges through colonial governments with differing rights to land, property, education, justice would mitigate the decolonial resistances formed in solidarity. So this type of stratification we have also seen in our history because we know that the divide and conquer is a primary tool of the colonizers, because when you divide and get people to fight with each other from the illusion of limited resources, then we can then it mitigates us coming together and creating solidarity and resistance against the oppressor, which in this case would be the colonizers. So what is decolonizing? So I want to have this conversation for you to understand why I've been like slashing D/colonizing. I've been slashing D/colonizing because when I think of resisting colonization and whatever the remnants of it that we now have left in once colonized places, and whatever the conditions are for folks who are in settler colonial spaces, I don't think that we can achieve something very pure and devoid of colonizing influences, just because colonization has become so pervasive that I don't think it's possible. When I think of the cultural context of India, I don't know what a pre-colonial, no, without any colonial influence would look like, and whether it makes sense to return us to that space, because that space is not an innocent space either. That space probably would have issues of patriarchy, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, anti-Blackness, so colorism. So because of that, casteism. So because of all of that, um, I I don't know that there is a pure space, but I don't think we could stop dreaming radically about a future where all people are free, that no people are oppressed or enslaved, and all people are free. So to imagine a future that is utopian and creates freedom for all people, and currently dealing with whatever way we are dealing with colonial forces, structures, oppression, we are not in a pure space of decolonizing. So that's why I have de/colonizing, to create this movement between a dream state and negotiating the reality that we are in today. And so the memories of the future is this memories of these dreams. And I write decolonizing in present continuous tense because I think is present and continuous. So it is something that we have to continuously interrogate in however way it shows up to us, and whichever way we have become complicit with it as well. And another thing about this is the superiority of Western knowledge. So, starting from Western civilization, what colonizing discourses and forces have done is created an erasure of knowledge systems that existed prior to Western civilization. It's as if the world's history started when Western civilization started, and nothing was present before that. No knowledge, no wisdom, no history. And so what that does is it erases a lot of knowledge systems that we had in our cultural histories. And so a decolonizing agenda with a slash would want to trace some of those to say, what have we forgotten? What can be revived, what can be reclaimed, what can be named and situate in a cultural context that is also helpful, because we can't take away everything that we understand from Western knowledge, but we can try to revive certain things that we may have forgotten. So Linda Thuya Smith is this Maori indigenous scholar, and she had created this text. It's a beautiful text. If you have time to read it, please read it. It's called Decolonizing Methodologies. It was a foundational text in my graduate studies and really changed the trajectory of what I was doing in my graduate study. And I want to offer you the opportunity to read that, because prior to that, I understood research as something that is universally applicable and research methodology to be universally applicable. And I didn't understand that there's a way that research has been culturally situated and historically situated and has certain structures of power embedded in it. And she taught me that. And it had opened up a world of understanding of research to me that I didn't consider prior to that. And it definitely coming from a much more traditional background of doing psychology and biochemistry, I was not introduced to this way of thinking about research. So Linda Thuya Smith traces how power is embedded explicitly and implicitly in Western discourse via its rule of classification, framing, and practice. So any effort to challenge these rules is also co-opted within Western rules of engagement for argument building. So in other words, if you want to challenge, you have to use the master's tools to challenge the master's rules. Well, you can't really do that because the house always wins. The master's tools are not, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let me get out of here for a minute and go back into it. Okay. So the master's tools are not meant to break the master's house. And this is not my word. This is a Black feminist. Her name is Audre Lorde. And she talked about that the master's tools cannot break the master's house. So when we are challenging these things, we have to think beyond the master's house to think of tools and resistance strategies that are not those that have been given to us through the colonizing discourses or through Western rules of engagement and for argument building. And so that requires a paradigm shift, that requires a diverse way of understanding inquiry. So I want to introduce you to this concept called knowledge epistemicide. So remember when we said epistemology is how do we know what we know? Knowledge epistemicide is erasure, killing, murdering certain systems of knowledge. So Smith, Linda Thuya Smith, situates the European Enlightenment era as the source of the Industrial Revolution, the development of various scientific disciplines and public education, arguing that imperialism contributed to this development. So if you read her book, she traces back various knowledge systems and how it created imperialism and how it engaged in erasure. Edward Said notes that the regimes of truth in Western knowledge making often contain knowledge stolen from colonized territories, but with restricted or limited access to the communities from which theft occurred. So this is this very same thing that I introduced earlier, that this type of stealing and co-opting happened all the time. It's part of colonial history. And then here are some examples of epistemicide, 4 examples of epistemicide. The conquest of Al-Andalus and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe, the killing of millions of Indo-European women, mostly through burning at the stake as witches, because their knowledge practices were not controlled by men, conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Americas begun by the Spanish, continued by the French and English, and still underway in the early 21st century, creation of slave trade that resulted in millions of people being killed in Africa and at sea, and more being totally dehumanized by enslavement in the Americas. And then one other epistemicide example, the Spanish burned hundreds of thousands of books in libraries in Cordova and elsewhere, destroyed codices in the Mayan, Inca, and Aztec empires, and silenced women's transmission of knowledge via oral traditions. People from Africa were considered less than human, similarly how indigenous people that I told you earlier, and treated with grotesque forms of dehumanization through various imperialist racist ideologies. So, as I mentioned earlier, that the imperialist gaze is to use only their rules of engagement to challenge them. So Membe identified the problematic nature of Western superiority of knowledge construction as a byproduct of the Enlightenment era due to its hegemonic construction of discursive scientific practices. He explains that it carries interpretive frames that make it difficult to think outside of this frame. So if these are the tools with which you can talk, then you are supposed to be not a good scholar, a good researcher, a good critical thinker if you don't use these tools. But this is not all. This hegemonic tradition also actively represses anything that actually is articulated, thought, and envisioned from outside of these frames. So therefore, in addition to academic gatekeeping and privileging Western knowledge construction, the rules of engagement for disrupting established practices and inquiry must also fit the construct of Western superiority. And that's where it becomes problematic, because if they limit you to how you can protest against them, then they still get to maintain the power hierarchy that they maintain for Western superiority of knowledge. So what is the imperialist gaze? So the imperialist gaze is to ensure the success of colonization by controlling and erasing native people's ways of being and knowing, and the colonizers needed to understand the native. So various different types of cultural studies were done in qualitative research called ethnographies, where people would go and live with the natives to understand them. And once they understood the natives, then they used that sort of gaze, the surveillance that came from the research, to control them. So once they understood the native, only then could they develop effective structures of discipline and surveillance to ensure obedience and exploitation. So Mamdani argues that this is how research became entangled with imperialism. I have this published and explained in broader detail in a publication in an Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education published by Oxford University Press. If you want the piece, please let your moderator know. I'll be happy to send over a link to the piece link to the full text of the piece. So in that article, what I argue for, and many other decolonizing scholars argue for, is democratizing knowledge, intellectual diversity, and pluriversity. So what that means is that knowledge doesn't have to flow from west to east or north to south. It can be multidirectional. And it can also have diversity from various cultural contexts from which the knowledge is being created. And then we bring in a pluralized understanding of knowledge. So what I say is that there has to be some interdependent and multidirectional relationship between land-based systems, history, heritage, justice frameworks from grassroots and community actions, and communal onto epistemologies. So to do this, we have to critique Eurocentric models of inquiry. We have to have a historical understanding of global movement of knowledge so we can open up spaces and create a knowledge diaspora. Now, this might be a little bit of a triggering idea that I'm just about to say, but a lot of Western knowledge system through which scientific inquiry is positioned creates this notion of objectivity. But I'm going to tell you that objectivity is a fallacy. There is no such thing, nothing that you can do that is devoid of human influence. Human inquiry cannot be devoid of human influence. Therefore, nothing is 100% objective. But that is the notion that we have been fed. And if anybody is not that, and if you have human influence, then supposedly the work that you do is not as strong as if you didn't have human influence. But there is no intellectually honest way to argue that the human inquiry is devoid of human influence. So if it's integrated with human influence, then we have to also ask, for whom is this research and who benefits from this study or who benefits from this work? And that creates an understanding of context that is very important in understanding how research is constructed and how research is disseminated and how research is made accessible or not. So what I teach people, and it's not my idea, but it's a well-accepted idea, that research is a shared agreement. People got together and decided certain ideas that they want to share together. Now, certain ideas, certain steps, certain principles, certain approaches, certain assumptions, certain theories. Now, the question then becomes, who was in the room when these shared agreements were being made? And so whose interests got preserved and whose didn't? And so if nothing else, I want you to understand that what we take for granted as research and how we approach our work isn't innocent, even if it has been transmitted down and been presented that this is just what you do, that we have our own agency to question some things. Why are we doing it this way? Why haven't we considered this? From our cultural constructs, does it make sense to just do it this way? Or can we expand the thinking to be more culturally responsive? So those conversations probably were not had, when certain shared agreements were being made. But research is always a shared agreement, and it's never devoid of the human influence on it. So what I want to introduce you to is the two philosophies of inquiry through which predominantly certain Western research has been understood. And these philosophies of inquiry lead us to an understanding of research, but a limited understanding of research. And these philosophies of inquiry also keep us contained within the Western epistemology, Western knowledge-making systems of here are the rules of engagement, here are the assumptions, and stay within these lanes and don't go outside of these lanes. So those two ideas are positivism and post-positivism. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of background on positivism and post-positivism by sharing with you that positivism is a term that has historical roots in the works of Auguste Comte and Francis Bacon. Positivist perspectives usually rely on unambiguous and accurate knowledge of the world. Positivist inquiry relies on observation. Often that is through scientific observation, using methodologies that demonstrate a shared agreement with similar-minded scholars. While such an explanation would imply that there should be only one way of understanding positivism, Crotty, in a 1999 text, reported that there are at least 12 varieties of positivism, which probably we can't talk about it today because our time is limited. However, I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of positivism somewhat in an abbreviated way. Comte discussed positivism beyond using mathematical terms to understand social patterns of human behavior via observation, experimentation, and comparison. The Vienna Circle of logical positivists relied more on mathematical functions and verifiability in positivism. So if I said that a cat has 4 legs, it was verifiable as long as I was able to count the legs. For more abstract human behavior, verifiability was relegated to our senses and carefully developed and agreed upon instrumentation. So that would be the work that I do as a social scientist. From 1990s and beyond, positivism became heavily reliant on mathematical functions and operated under the assumptions that empirical scientific knowledge is both accurate and certain. Certain is the key word. This form of unified scientific knowledge created a binary between objective ways of knowing as scientific and subjective ways of knowing as unscientific. So if I know something from my perspective that's not scientific, but if we can find some way to do the work using the shared agreements, then it's more scientific. In other words, science does not bother with the social construction of meaning. This way creates an artificial binary between value neutral and value driven research when there is no clear way to really draw a line between such ideas. Within post-positivist frameworks, physicists and other scholars raised questions about the dogma about positivist approaches to scientific knowledge construction. Niels Bohr, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and Werner Heisenberg introduced the notion of uncertainty in scientific knowledge while studying subatomic particles and their movements. The notion of uncertainty introduced a chasm between what positivists aim to do and what is scientifically possible. In addition, another post-positivist scholar, Sir Karl Popper, introduced the idea of falsification. So if I can falsify everything and still claim what I want to claim, then I have rigor, then I have objectivity, But even if a theory or hypothesis can stand refutation, it can only be accepted as conditionally true with the conditions specified and the degree of uncertainty accounted for in the final claim. So the essence of Popper's claim of scientific statement is that every one of them is tentative forever. And then Thomas Kuhn introduced the idea of paradigm and paradigm shift when discussing scientific inquiry. He stated that all scientists operate from some sort of theoretical background that reflects the scientist's understanding about knowledge and inquiry. However, if during inquiry findings exceed the parameters of the paradigm, then there is a crisis. A scientist can then try to force fit the findings into an existing paradigm or be open to new ways of understanding, thereby causing what he termed as paradigm shift. Kuhn's ideas about science and scientific inquiry then not only creates space for uncertainty, but subjectively situates the researcher within certain paradigms that are only stable until new evidence is presented to contest the boundaries of the paradigm. So what the post-positivist scholars created was a discursive space. So that means a space where we can have discussions, the space where we can be engaging in dialogues that question the ahistorical, acultural, value-neutral understanding of reality and scientific inquiry. These ideas have created room for what is known as the constructionist view of meaning making of reality. So because it's Bijoya, I had to have a picture of Bijoya today. So Shubha Bijoya to everyone. And the constructionist view of meaning making and reality is that when you have people doing studies and research, we have to understand that the meaning making is contingent on people's interaction with experiences, knowledge systems, the world events, histories, and all of this creates a constructionist view of the world, as in this is the way they construct meaning making, sense making of the world. So, with that, I want to situate how do we understand this type of meaning making and how do we think about it in ways that we can then employ it in inquiry. So George Day, he's a Ghanaian scholar. He's at the University of Toronto. So he says the Akan people say, if you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, ask the one carrying it. I won't read the Ghanaian sentence because I probably will dishonor it by my pronunciation. From this, we are directed to ask the bearer of knowledge as knower of this knowledge, its contents and its spirit for information. The Akan people suggest that through this proverb that knowledge cannot be acquired through observation or through fragmentation of measurement. Knowledge comes from and can only be voiced by the one who bears the felt and lived experience of this knowledge, the bag of salt, and therefrom knows. So if we go back to the indigenous research that colonizers were doing by, creating dehumanizing arguments about it, and if that was the only thing that they were doing, then obviously the history of science would erase what was it like for the indigenous people to have it be dehumanized and have their knowledge system be erased. Another example would be Margaret Mead went to Samoan village and studied the women in and the culture of Samoan village and made the argument. Margaret Mead is an American cultural anthropologist and made the argument that the women in Samoan village were backwards and they walked around without clothes and they exposed their breasts, so they were backwards, they were not interested in education. And she made meticulous observation of all of that, which then again promoted the Western binary of colonizers and colonized, where the colonized is always a backwards group. And so what ends up happening when you do research like that and you position the researcher as somebody who is apparently value neutral is that it's not intellectually accurate, because Margaret Mead had values about what civilized look like, what is the value of education, what is the way in which women should be in a community and look civilized to her. And so from that perspective, even though her processes were aligned with the shared agreement of what is known to be objective and what could be verifiable, the interpretation of that information was grounded in her constructed world. And so if we ignore that, then we ignore a lot of information that comes from a researcher's own positionality. So then what does it mean to decolonize science? So these are some of the ideas that I want to offer you. It's to decolonize science means it's to construct and legitimize other culturally situated native indigenous knowledge systems by exploring alternative epistemologies. How do we know what do we know? Ontologies, realities, ways of being, and methodologies, and consider the hybridity between colonizing and decolonizing knowledge systems, because this would be difficult to create a pure space for it. And so there are certain conversations that are happening within various scientific communities that are talking about decolonizing your mind. So this is from the Nature magazine, where they had this quote and said, decolonizing is going to happen in the mind. Says Sianda Makula, a former cardiology lecturer who now works in university governance. Such shifts in thinking could mean, for example, that pharmacology students hear how drugs are being developed from plants their grandmothers used to treat stomachache. This would show the relevance of traditional culture in modern science and anchor the curriculum in local experience. So when we are thinking about teaching science, then how can we use our local experiences, local cultural knowledge to think about, designing curriculum that is also culturally responsive and culturally situated. So, in other words, decolonizing science, if you want to think about what might you be doing to think of decolonizing science, I divided into four constructs. So one is contextual understanding. So this is the cultural understanding, which is closely related to knowledge revival. And I kind of created a Venn diagram because they're kind of all related and they overlap with each other. So cultural understanding and knowledge revival is what knowledge in our cultural system got erased, and in the case of India, through multiple colonizing experiences. And if we can revive and reclaim that, then we can integrate that with our curriculum development. And then the next question to ask is, for whom is this work? Who has access? Who is being represented? Who do we share this work with? Whose needs are being met? So those are relational ethics that we have to keep in mind, so that even if we are doing things that is a hybrid of Western and culturally situated practices, we still have to wonder, like, who benefits from it and to whom are we obligated when we do this work. And so these are the questions that I want to ask yourself, and I'll conclude with these questions. So these questions are, knowledge. What knowledge system is forgotten in science education? For whom is this work? Who are you accountable to? Who benefits from this work? And what are you willing to interrogate, as opposed to accepting a knowledge system without having some criticality built into it? And with that, I conclude. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So right now we haven't had any questions. I request the audience to please post your questions so that ma'am can address them right now. Maybe you can comment some more on the topic, something. Yeah.
Ask me a question, Shinjini. What question you have?
Right now, I don't have a question as such. It was a very enlightening lecture.
Mm.
So
What stood out to you?
it was very interesting knowing the. Sorry, no, I think my network is having some problems. It's getting stuck at times.
I think Shinjini has some problem, net issues. She has came.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, ma'am.
That's all right.
So, okay, we have one question here, it seems. So, do you think traditional knowledge should be included in the education system, especially in India?
Yes, absolutely. I do think traditional knowledge should be included. There's so much we have in our own cultural histories that we might have sidelined or eclipsed, or maybe used the colonizers' way of thinking that that's backwards or that doesn't have any value. And perhaps it has more value if we look more closely to it. As I said, I don't think that there is a pure space of return to a pre-colonial place, because that had its own issues and problems as well. But I don't think that we erase everything that we knew and practiced, within our cultural traditions and within our knowledge systems, that we need to abandon all of it in favor of Western knowledge systems. So I do think that, some of the traditional knowledge can certainly be brought back forward and integrated into our work.
Okay. Professor Ray Banerjee to give her comments as well.
Yeah,
Sure.
I have a lot of questions. Kakali, the thing is, it was, you were going, I was hoping that we will learn more. And then suddenly it ended, and we were still like in a daze. What more is going to come? So, a lot of questions. So, the first thing is that today, science and technology, especially the way we do it, and you have explained it so nicely that. We are so colonized in our minds, not only in the way of thinking. And let me share, I am right now the head of the department of a 103-year-old department of zoology, which when I first came, and I'm speaking this in public, but still I will go ahead and do it, is that I found that my colleagues, when it comes to naming rooms and seminar halls, would invariably, suggest names of Western scientists as a commemorative, which I thought was so ridiculous. And I had just returned from the West. From USA, I had worked in the commercial sector for the Tatas, and then I'm back to my alma mater, and I see that unfortunately most of my department, there's a bit of an inbreeding also, that students of the department, we go on to become teachers. So that is also a kind of colonization, that there is no outside perspective coming in. So I found your lecture to be so illuminating, and I would really like to invite you to talk directly to our students, because this is a huge community which is listening in to your lectures. But if this is done in a more focused classroom setting, because frankly, Kakali, we are not even aware that somebody like you is thinking in those lines, and there are people who are thinking beyond just objective statistical derivation of something to say a yes or a no. Especially in traditional knowledge, it is so contextual. For example, like you said, if you are looking for a phytochemical, then it is the medicinal plant is there. It has to take its cues upstream from the soil, from the agronomy. So not only the genetic part of the plant, but also the epigenetic instructions to sequester certain kinds of medicinal bioactive compounds, which was there earlier, but now it may not be there. So it is very contextual. And then with the latest revivalist trend going on in my country, everything is propagated as if it is already said in our ancient literature. Unfortunately, Kakali, most of the Sanskrit scholars would have no knowledge of science and technology, and vice versa. So what happens is, earlier people would talk in riddles. People will not say something very, straightforward. It is very nuanced and very layered, and it is very contextual. So I find, the points that you have put forth has really, challenged my thinking, that the way we are conditioned, especially in science and technology, and there is a bit of a patriarchy also in science and technology, because the science and technology students think that, they are something better than the students of arts and, liberal arts and social sciences. So everything is looked at from the point of view of the colonizers, that and Bengalis are a very good example of that, because we were the babus and the clerks who were doing the work for the British, and English education, formal academic education, is so with the blinkers.
Yeah.
And when I was listening to, I have never heard anybody explain a subject as you have done. And we have something called the CBCC, which is choice based credit system, CBCS. And this was instituted so that people from different subjects could get a taste of, like you had psychology and then you had mathematics and biochemistry, and people could do it. But unfortunately, even in our students, that decolonization has to happen, that knowledge for the sake of knowledge and not for the sake of some kind of a job which is there and ready for you. So if you would like to comment on that, please.
Yeah, so a lot of thoughts came up. So many thoughts came up. A few years ago, when I was in India, there was a family friend was talking to another family friend and saying, like, to me, saying how they were proud of me that I could still speak and read and write in Bengali, in Bangla, after all these years, and of being in the US, being in the West, I've been in Canada and US. So, and I left when I was in my early teens. So, and so somebody else just said, well, what's the point in that? Because knowing native knowledge, knowing heritage knowledge is not going to give me a job. Knowing English will give me a job. That's the currency of the world. And that's actually true. It is the currency of the world. And it's a global trade at the moment. And because it's a global trade at the moment, we are having to do so much work in this language and reading texts in this language. One of my aunts did her dissertation, and she did the dissertation both in Bangla and in English. And I was in awe of that. To be able to describe something academically in Bangla and also in English is very hard to do. The depth of understanding of nuance in both languages academically is very hard to do. I can't do it in Bangla the way I can do it in English. I can speak Bangla well, but I can do it in Bangla. I cannot do it in Bangla. And so I think about the losses. I always think about the losses, like what has been lost, in us wanting to be such a civilized subject of a colonized system. For example, sometimes when people say to me over here in US, oh, you speak English so well, I get like really insulted sometimes, because like, what do you mean I speak English so well? I've been speaking English since I was a little girl. What do you mean? But then I have to think, like, what am I taking pride in? I'm taking pride in being a very good colonized subject. That's what I'm taking pride in, and it's not worthy of taking pride that much, like, so what if I didn't know English? Like, I look at China and they restrict people's access to English, to heritage, to privileged heritage language more. Now they have English language learning and they are doing that, but they're nowhere near how much the middle class Indian people know English versus the middle class Chinese people know English. And I wonder what that does when you preserve certain things that are heritage knowledge systems, basically. And in my own work, because I do work to interrogate things, I had to begin to look towards Indian freedom fighters and thinkers, and what were they thinking while the British was around, to be interrogative in their stance. So I've kind of returned to Sukumar Rai's work, and there are people who have been able to look at Sukumar Rai's nonsense as something that is not without sense or meaning, and that it's satirical, and it has parody, and it has critique of Bengali Babus and of British colonizers, and like simple things like Baburam Chapure, like the whole thing about the snake being defanged and not making any noise, and only being given food when they want, only so that they can kill the snake at the end, and I didn't have that understanding when I read that as a child. I didn't have that understanding. I thought it was just a fun poem, and yes, kill the snake, even though we worship the snake for Shiri, but yeah, kill the snake because it's a snake, I didn't have that nuanced understanding. It took some distancing to then return back and reclaim that. And I was thinking, how smart was it for Sukumar Rai to do that? This was in 1921. He did it. 1919, we had Jallianwala Bagh, and people were killed for no goddamn good reason. And then we had 1921. Sukumar Rai puts their own, press, uses their own press, so the British can't censor it, and then puts up these things that have no real sense making. If you want to translate it, it's not intelligible. If you want to translate it, Hiji Beach is not intelligible. Hajabara is not intelligible, and then of course all of this mixed up words that he brings up in there, those are not really anything. They don't mean anything, and he contextualizes that in a dream sequence. Sometimes somebody's dreaming and then there is like a plotless story that is happening, and you look a little deep and you see that there is critique in there, and on the surface level there isn't. And I found that to be so inspiring, to be able to have critique of a dominant system through art, and it gets transmitted intergenerationally. Like there are people who are in Western spaces that are from the subcontinent that still teach Sukumar Rai to their children, and it gets transmitted intergenerationally. So then it preserves language. So those are some of the thoughts that came up when you said, all of these things to me. I've been thinking about, what do I reclaim that I didn't know, through my own colonizing educational upbringing.
In science and technology, the other thing that I find crippling is that academics are required to sort of, dance to a predominantly Western audience, which I find sort of humiliating.
Yeah.
So for promotions, one has to have these academic point index scores, which are given on the basis of impact factors.
Yes.
Now, impact factors of journals are, I find, sometimes very subjective, because a lot of power and a lot of position, a lot of bias goes into it. Whereas the science is basically for making life a little bit easier.
Sure.
And it cannot happen without a deep understanding and empathy for the people, for society and culture where we are. But right now, science and technology in India is stripped of that identity and made to be, and objectivity can go so far. Even a person who is analyzing the data is the person with his or her, spiritual beliefs and cultural conditioning and everything that goes into it. So how would you, comment on that we need to do something about this? So these are, sort of soulless practices, are not really taking us anywhere. Not many original thoughts, not many innovations are coming out of the scores of people getting degrees, highest degrees, even PhDs in science and technology. Your comments?
Yeah. So here in the US, that's also the same. So promotion and tenure is based on where you publish and what is the impact factor on that. And it is the same. The criticism is the same from those of us who do challenge systems. And that seems to be what I have been doing even when I was a young girl. I've been always challenging some systems, or some way of thinking. And I'm like, why aren't we thinking this other way? And so a lot of us, and especially folks that are senior scholars, they started creating their own journals. They started going, because they might have had publications with let's say, like some of the Western publication companies we have is Sage publication or Routledge publications or Springer publications, Springer Palgrave publications. And so they would go to these places and say, will you work with us if we open up a journal? And then they would open up a journal. But there are so many journals that get indexed. So to get to that high place requires so much manipulation to get to that high place. So a lot of us now offer people who go for tenure and promotion a statement from the editor of the journal, in terms of like what is the journal's rejection rate, how many papers do the journal get, and they also the why the scope of the journal is wide and interdisciplinary, and why is it prestigious. And a lot of them end up offering, the editor offers those letters for people that go up for tenure and promotion. And sometimes those editors also get called as external reviewers to people's portfolios and packets when they go up for different types of promotional criteria. I don't think that we have addressed this very well either, because we need to be able to create more spaces where innovative writing comes up and innovative thinking comes up. And there are journals that will allow that, but they are not as common as others. And so we, the scholars, have to make very hard arguments to the people who are assessing our work to say that this knowledge making is worthy. And I have literally in my own work argued that I am not talking to people who are cultural outsiders to me. I talk with my work, I talk to people who are in similar positions as I am, as my primary audience. I have secondary audience too. The secondary audience can be cultural outsiders, but I expect them to do some work to understand and create entry point to my work, because I had to do that work too. When I was reading Western scholars, I had to create intelligibility from people that never considered anybody like me when they were writing those things. So if I had to make the journey, I think it's just fair that those who are cultural outsiders to me can pause and look at what a culturally situated work would look like. So a lot of times in my work, I would have, so of course I have to write in English, but I would put in, Bangla words, Hindi words, all sorts of other ideas that are, that are culturally situated for me. And I would explain using that. So I've explained using these middle spaces in which we occupy, we are colonized, but we are interrogating this. And so I would use certain things like, I found this concept of loka, so it's this belt between the mountains, and there is this middle space in there. And I would use that as my framing device to understand, like, what does that mean when we are in this middle space of wanting to interrupt things and also having to deal with the materiality of the truth and the forces that keep us limited. And so I've been sort of pushing back in my own work, and whoever I mentor, I've been telling them to push back. I've been telling them to revive their own cultural systems. I've been helping them to make justification for it, academic justification for it, as to why. I've been asking them to ask questions back. If I'm not authorized to talk about this from a culturally situated position, who's authorized to talk about this? And then that creates that question, that who else is authorized to talk about things that I know? Who else is authorized to talk about that? If I need an outsider to talk about this, or if I need to position an outsider as the person who evaluates me, I have to ask, how is the person going to create a bridge to something that they haven't experienced yet? So goes back to that, that Akan proverb that I was saying, that, there is legitimization on a scholar who has firsthand experience of navigating certain systems of knowledge and writing from that position. And if we don't make space for that, and we say people who pretend to be value neutral and who pretend to be objective, but that's a value. Pretending to be objective is a value too. So it's not value neutral, it's still value. It's just the shared agreement is that this is a good thing to do. The shared agreement erases the humanity of human inquiry. And I think that is the most absurd thing. So I've been like pushing back with absurdity, because, I'm inspired by Shukumar Rai. So pushing back by absurdity, going, how are you going to argue that the thing that you're doing is devoid of humanity or human influence when a human being is doing this work?
শব্দ চয়ন এত সুন্দর. She's so articulate. What I'm saying is, you are so articulate, and the words that you choose and the expressions that you use, they communicate so much. So the other question I wanted to ask you, and we've had this discussion, that we so institutes of higher education, research institutes where cutting edge research is done in science and technology, so STEMM basically.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of outreach, science camps are held,
Sure.
where some exhibits will be put up or someone will give a lecture, but often the content is not curated. So it is like, so we invite a bunch of people who talk about stuff. Now whether that stuff is intelligible to the people, to the audience, or whether it is relevant, that often is very difficult to understand. And so one ends up organizing these camps not really knowing whether there was any impact. So I'll put that impact within quotes. And so this is something that has been bugging me, that how would you think, from your knowledge area, how one can sort of begin to understand?
Yeah, so my mom actually was a science educator. So she was teaching science teachers how to teach science. So I ended up publishing one paper with her, and she's in deep south in US, in Louisiana, and there are gators there too, by the way. And she has a bayou as her backyard, and we literally see gators floating on the bayou. Very scary, by the way. So anyway, she she wasn't theoretical in her thinking, but she was very pragmatic in her thinking, in the sense like people need to understand science from a first person experience. Like if they experience something, if they touch it, if they measure it, if they look at it, if they um, if they have their own shifts in thinking, that's where the impact is. And she was teaching science teachers. So if these educators shifted by having certain things that they could understand from their local cultural experiences with science, then they will end up creating pedagogy for their students, so that their students can also understand things from local cultural understanding as well. Because a lot of times we teach how we have been taught unless we start interrogating how we have been taught. And some of us, from our cultural perspectives, it took me a long time after coming to the West to even think that we can have critique of our educators, because that's culturally not something I'm trained to think. Educators are very revered in my mind culturally, and or that education system is also very revered. That system can be critiqued was not something I came to very easily. It took a lot to come to that. But what I understood, because I collaborated with her in a publication as a result of that, and so what I understood from that was that if you can build systems of learning where she had like certain measurement equipment that they were putting in the bayou, in the bayou water, and then that was giving outputs of certain measurements, pH levels of water and other things, and so this was an integrated of science education integrated with some technology built into it as well. And what we were finding was that in that study, the people who benefited a lot, and we did a pre-test, post-test, we had certain scales that we were using, and those scales were designed to measure learning, learning impact, attitudes towards science education, attitudes towards future aspirations. These were surveys, scales, instrumentation that had been tested, piloted, had high validity, reliability. And what we found was the learning that was happening because people were playing with all that technology in those contexts. The context was familiar. What was unfamiliar to them was the use of the technology to understand some scientific ideas, constructs, principles, but the context was familiar. These are places they have grown up in. These are things they have always known. But now we are giving them another way. So this is probably Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift thinking that we're giving them another way to look at that context. So there was all this bantering going on amongst them. So what are you doing? What are you doing? And some people were very intimidated with some of that, new technology, new learning, and the bantering became social learning amongst the peers, and that social learning became the thing that collectively moved them forward. Those that were falling a little behind were getting moved forward with those that were excited by the new information that they were discovering. And then based on that new information, they were able to create some understanding of what was going on. They were supposed to build hypotheses before going into this. Then they used the technology to test their hypothesis, and then they used the data to support what they were claiming. And it was all done, with something that was so tangible for them. That wasn't an abstract thinking that they were just going to memorize and perform, in a test. It was something that was embodied. And so as a result of that, they were able to do really well, and help their students learn really well. So mostly what I am inspired by is when people have these learning experiences that are so embodied that you almost create muscle memory for it, and then you have the memory, and then you argue from that place. Then you know what it feels like. Then that's that first person experience of it.
Wonderful. I think for the last few years, I've been dreaming of doing this. That Kakali and I must have this conversation, and now we are having this conversation for the others to listen in also. So,
Yeah.
very, very thought-provoking discussion. Our moderator Shinjini and Akashlina, I saw that they were peeping in. Are there more questions for Professor Bhattacharya?
Yes, ma'am. There two questions have come up. So,
Okay.
so one of them is, how can we revive the Indian traditional medicinal practices and knowledge and use this forgotten knowledge in modern research?
That's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for Professor Ray Banerjee to answer, because it's out of my knowledge system. I haven't studied medicinal practices, and I haven't studied. I don't know what is forgotten knowledge in modern research. So that is the work of somebody who has ideas about traditional medicinal practices and who understands what is forgotten knowledge. So I'm sure that there are folks that work in that, where they trace the history of medicine. So I would say, from an educator's perspective, I could respond to that, to say that if in the curriculum we had courses that was Indian traditional medicine, and that was a course, and we had courses of, Indian traditional philosophy of inquiry. Like if we had courses like that in our curriculum, since I am an educational researcher, then that would be a gateway to that. But the technical parts of like what needs to be revived, what needs to be medicinal practices, that I don't know. But I think that there has to be sort of a cultural buy-in that this is necessary and this is good. And so folks that are in positions of influence, so educators, policymakers, the folks that are in positions of influence have to push that forward to say um, these type of knowledge system is important and needs to be preserved and not forgotten. And that has to be local conversations, and then obviously state conversation, and then national conversations as well. But I do think that traditional medicinal practices have a lot of value, so we do need to teach people that. I just don't know what those traditional practices are and what has been forgotten. So if we can have scholars who trace this and do this work, it can even be a seminar that can have rotational scholars doing that work, so that one person doesn't have to carry the whole seminar. And that's knowledge diversity that I was talking about. That's knowledge pluriversity that I was talking about. And so it can be revived. It just needs more buy-in from people to be able to do so. But Vijay, thank you for asking that. And Shubha Vijaya.
And another question is, what are the decolonizing strategies in the field of research?
That's a really good question, Akash. That I can answer. So decolonizing strategies first starts in the mind. So that's in the mind of you, Akash. You have to ask yourself, what colonizing ideas have you first, taken for granted and normalized, so what are some of that? And it takes some time, it takes some interrogative work. So part of what would part of what you would need to do is read other scholars who have been talking about decolonizing research for some time. So a good place to start would be to start with Linda Thuy Smith's work, so that you understand um, the the arguments philosophically about what is decolonizing and what are some decolonial ways of thinking about things. You know, Second would be to look at the field of research and say, what are some colonizing understandings that are being promoted in this? So that would take some historical understanding and what comes down the pipeline for that. So I do qualitative research, so it's different from quantitative research. So in my field, I can tell you what I have been doing. So qualitative research is understanding people's lived experiences, essentially. And so what in traditional field of research, understanding people's lived experiences uh, was um, was made to be something where the researcher is the instrument of surveillance on people's lives. And so people were seen as data repositories and researchers seen as the data abstractors. So then our job as researchers is to go, extract data from the people and then use it whichever way we see fit and put it up for knowledge consumption. And so in doing so, it became exploitative of the people who were giving us information on the backs of whom we were then gaining academic mileage, essentially. So a decolonial way of thinking about that would be to not think of people as data repositories and researchers as data extractors. So for us, then it meant to be in relationship with people, to be in community with people, and to have those people have a say in what we say about them, in what we produce knowledge about them, especially if you're getting knowledge from them, and to make that knowledge accessible to them. Because a lot of times where we publish, is behind a paywall and it's indexed by library systems. And if the people with whom we're working aren't accessing that or doesn't have access to that, then essentially the knowledge that we created from them with them isn't being able to accessed by them. So then it becomes our responsibility to make sure that they have access to the knowledge as well. So that's in my field in qualitative research. And also for my field, I have been using a lot of theoretical frameworks that are positioned from non-Western perspectives as well. So I use a lot of theoretical frameworks to help understand a research design or to frame a research design that is much more culturally situated and much more culturally responsive. And so I use that. So those are some of the strategies to think about, is like, in what way is your field colonized? What are some colonizing moves that your field makes? How might you disrupt that? How might people have disrupted that before you came along? What precedence is there in decolonizing that work? And then what strategies have people used? What strategies can you use? And this is where, Akash, I think it's okay to think creatively and imaginatively instead of thinking, will it be accepted by a research field first? Just to brainstorm. Once you think it creatively and imaginatively, you can give it shape in an academic way, but don't restrict yourself from thinking that way just because it hasn't been done yet. A lot of times, what I end up having to do is to help students make up new methods of data collection that doesn't exist yet, in traditional literature, but it makes a lot of sense when they want to engage with it in a way that is responsive to the community with whom they are working. So if you need to have an innovative approach or an innovative thought, you can't do that unless you give yourself permission to think innovatively. So I would say give yourself permission to think beyond boundaries, beyond borders, beyond restriction, and just think, if you want to know this, what would be some ways you want to know this, whatever it is that you're trying to know and learn and understand, and list it all up, and then interrogate what has colonial influences and what doesn't. And I don't know that you can ever have something that is purely decolonial and doesn't have any colonial influences. That's why I said we have to be in this hybrid space of doing. But at the same time, I want to say that when you are looking at your choices or whatever you have brainstormed, look at the ones that you feel like very strongly about, and then create academic arguments to defend it. Because then you are pushing your field further, and we all have that obligation to push our field further, because otherwise the field goes stagnant if we don't push our field further.
So we have another question which is kind of answered already. How can we change common people's view of modern research with the existing traditional knowledge and its potential in improving human lifestyle?
So I think that requires leaving information accessible to common people, and being in relationship with common people, being in community with common people, doing exploratory understanding of communities that you want to be part of, or that you want information to be disseminated to understand what is it that they need, and what is it that their hunger for information, for knowledge, for relief from a problem, for a solution to an ongoing problem, whatever it is. If we start from that, and then we design whatever study we want to design from that, either in partnership with a community or a group of people that inspire our work. And then you have to figure out, how do we then disseminate this work back to the people so they have access. So it's not just a conversation. Of course, you want to have an academic conversation through your publication with your academic peers and academic elders, but you should also think of a parallel dissemination with the community, so that you produce the applicability of the knowledge as well. Like, how does it apply to improve somebody's life, to affect somebody's life, to affect somebody's living conditions?
So that is it, ma'am. So thank you again for such a wonderful lecture. I would like to request Professor Ray Banerjee to give the vote of thanks.
আমি মুগ্ধ হয়ে শুনছি। Wonderful. I have no words to say thank you. Acha, Shinjini, thank you for moderating. And I think Shoheli is in the backstage also doing something. So Shoheli, thank you, and Shinjini, thank you, and thank you to all our audience. But most of all, thank you so much, Kakali. Thank you so much. It has been so wonderful, and it has been such a learning experience for us. So I hope we take home whatever we learned in tonight's session and apply to our respective fields. And with our best wishes for your research, Kakali, continue to do the wonderful work that you are doing, and keep asking the questions and keep poking us, so that we can also sort of take a long and hard look in the mirror of the quality of the work that we are doing. I think that is so very important. So thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. All our previous talks are archived there, so you can check them out. You can also visit our website, www.zoologyhub.org. And thank you again for joining us. Until next time, take care and good night.